Take the guy in the password community that is not an academic, that has the best database of academic papers related to passwords and stuff. So, I mean, if you're looking into, finding research sources for anything passwords, Bruce is one of the guys you can really turn to. And 2 years ago, we had Jeff from Agile Bits giving a talk about, measuring password strength. And when I introduced him, I also told the audience that that topic is kind of interesting to discuss, measuring password strength. So I told the audience I did not want any kind of physical environment fighting in the room over that topic. Now we have advanced since like 2 years ago. So how secure multi-word rather than passphrases? I expect that to be a really interesting talk as well. And I don't want any kind of fighting.
Yeah, but so we can't throw horses and batteries out.
Correct.
Staples are fine.
Yeah. Good one. Bruce.
All right, thanks, Bear. Like he mentioned, I maintain the passwordresearch.com website. I do my best effort at trying to keep the database of papers related to passwords and other authentication technologies, but I'm always way behind. So I'm usually 50 papers or so behind whatever's currently out there. I also do have statistics, some of which are certainly just vendor surveys, and some of which are a little bit more scientific. So what's the average number of passwords a person has? How many websites do they use them on? Use the same password on, stuff like that. But yeah, today we're going to talk about passphrases. Jeffrey Goldberg actually did talk a little bit about this yesterday. I don't think I'm going to have too much overlap, so if you were in both sessions, you're probably going to be fine. So what are they very quickly? It's kind of hard to define because it's not a solid, once you hit 20 characters, it's a passphrase, 20 below, it's password, once it's 3 words, it's a passphrase, once it's, it's only 2, it's a password. We just have some general guidelines. Usually they're going to be words separated by spaces. There is going to be some overlap, like, one of the top 10 or top 100 passwords is let me in. That's technically a phrase, but if it's not spaces and stuff, some people would argue it's not a passphrase. So what's the goal behind passphrases? We need better security than passwords, but we know that random passwords are kind of hard for people to memorize as a general principle. So we're trying to find some sort of medium ground. People are better at memorizing words, so our passphrase is the good alternative to that. There's different types of passphrases, and Jeff kind of mentioned another one I would call pseudo-natural language phrases, where they're made-up words or words that are very similar in his talk yesterday, but mostly natural languages. If people are going to create their own passphrase, that's often what they fall to is, let me in, or things like that. Natural language structured phrases, which is something like, adverb, noun, verb, noun. It fits a structure, but you're taking words that aren't necessarily making sense to most of us in that context. You could also do things like, 5 nouns or things like that. Mentally chosen random words. The problem with that is, and a lot of people talk about the XKCD system, where people would forward that onto the friend and say, hey, use passphrases, and the person's like, all right, well, let's see, my computer, Dell, I'm on a chair, it's kind of boring here at work, calendar, they're thinking that they have a very limited vocabulary of what's random to them. They may not put much effort into that. And then securely chosen random words, which is where you're using a set word list most of the time, and you're making sure that you're using a good cryptographically sound random number generator to choose those rather than your own mindset. I'm kind of going back to that mentally chosen random words. So we have to throw a meme into the equation here. One of the problems is that, of course, like I said, people come up with the similar information or choose similar things. There's a good paper about this. This little one notation, I have a references section at the end. Kind of, if you really want to look up some of the research papers, there's some good information in them. This one, there was this paper written called Linguistic Properties of Multi-Word Passphrases, and it basically looked at Amazon's pay phrases, So it was a way for people to essentially purchase things without having to have saving their credit card information. They combined a pay phrase and then a PIN, so it wasn't just the pay phrase by itself. But they essentially said, come up with a secure phrase to help you through this purchase process. And so they essentially tested by just assembling lists, sports team names and cities, song titles and things like that. And they pretty much were able to, just guessing through the Amazon API, able to find a lot of those pay phrases that were valid, because Amazon would tell you if one was already chosen. They had to be unique as well. Anyway, so the idea being that we're often drawing on similar information, similar pools of random information to make it memorable, which is why, again, we tend to focus, if we're going to try to make something better than passwords, on going to the randomness route. Now, there's been a lot of popularity here, especially this year, past year, but passphrases aren't really new. This is an excerpt from the 1985 DoD password security standard, I'm forgetting the exact title, but they introduced passwords, and they talked about that, password management guidelines. That's the book, the lime green book in the Rainbow series. They talk about, hey, if we use combined 4, 5, and 6 letter words, we're going to end up with a 23,000 word dictionary, and how many, based on the guessing time, how many of those words do we need to have in a series before that offers the adequate security? Now, the one big difference between today and 1985 is that their guesses per minute were capped on the speed of a 1200 baud modem, which, today things are a little different. So Diceware. It's a system that came out in 1985 by a guy named Arnold Reinhold, and what I mean is by a formal system is that he basically tells you everything you need to do to utilize it. It's not necessarily just, hey, use passphrases. He says, here's the list of words to use, and here's how to randomly generate them. And the reason it's called Diceware is because he recommends using physical dice to produce those random numbers rather than random number generation on a computer. And I think the main reason was because there's not, especially back in 1985, 1985, there wasn't a lot of great sources for random number generators that were considered good random number generators. But it also allows you to have an completely offline system. You can print out the list of words, you can roll the dice, and if you're using it for a device that's not your laptop or your desktop, that password's never seen by that device. So technically, there's some segmentation between that. Essentially what you do is you roll either one dice 5 times or 5 dice once. You get a series of numbers 1 through 6. You look up that index in the paper and the actual word list, and that tells you what your first word is. And you do that for as many words as you are going to use for that passphrase. Pretty straightforward. And if you've ever, next screen may cause flashbacks for some of you. If you've ever been in any password discussion on the internet, you've got this burned into your retina already because it's undoubtedly going to come up in every discussion. XKDC 936, which is the actual page you can go to look it up, is a lot less formal. It's not a specific system. It was kind of a rough comparison that got turned into this cult of passphrase use, which is fine. But I think it left people with a lot of questions. Essentially, it's comparing, kind of a leet-speaked, typical, or maybe slightly better than typical password format, and comparing that from an entropy standpoint as far as bits of strength to something like a passphrase. He doesn't really say in the comic how many words he's drawing from or how many words minimum you should have. And clearly his example has 4. If you read into it a little bit, you see that he's saying 44 bits of strength from the total, which means each word has 11. You can kind of figure out that means it's 2,048 word dictionary that he's assuming you're pulling these words from. But that came out in 2011, and that's also helped kind of gain some popularity for it. But like I said, that we're not really left with a complete system to pull from. So there's sites like XKCD Password, or passphrase, I think, or there's different people that have tried to implement this in a system based off this same idea. So attacks against passphrases. Offline password cracking, your typical, someone dumps your database from a site you're on, or they get your PGP archive or drive or your TrueCrypt or whatever, and they've got something that they can try passwords or passphrases against. That's probably one of our main concerns when it comes to why we think we want to use passphrases. Online passphrase guessing is also a threat, but as we'll talk about in a little while, if you're actually using one of these more formalized systems, it's just not practical for someone to get your password via an online guessing attack. It's just way too slow. Shoulder surfing, I'm kind of curious as to whether, it'd be interesting to see a study based on, if someone's typing in a passphrase where you're using real words, presumably they might be able to type that faster than random characters, if it's actually easier or harder for them to shoulder surf, because they also tend to be longer. So there's potential for someone not seeing as much. As far as keystroke logging, man-in-the-middle, phishing, social engineering, they're pretty much compatible with passwords. There's nothing, having a long, strong passphrase is not going to do anything for you if someone has a Trojan on your system. So how do we estimate strength? And this is only specifically for random passphrases, because if we're drawing from our memory or if we're drawing from common things, this doesn't really work out. The entropy doesn't work out quite as well. So it's much like passwords, where you say, how many characters do we have to draw from? 95 is the typical maximum you have to draw from a keyboard, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols. With words, when we come up with dictionaries, it kind of converts that characters, turns into words. So your words are your characters that you're combining together to make your string. So then you take how many words are in that dictionary you're pulling from to the power of how many words you're choosing to add. So 4 words, so 1,000 words times to the power of 4 is going to give you, if you have a full word long. If you're trying to convert that back into bits, then to kind of estimate the strength to compare it against other passwords or symmetric keys, you've got to convert that to the base 2 log of that total that you're pulling from. So to kind of go back to the XKCD and Diceware suggestions, what we're looking at with a 2048 word list is around 44 bits for 4 words. Diceware has more words. They recommend a base of 5, so you get a little bit more bits protection. So what does that actually mean? I mean, that sounds great. Some of you already kind of have it, probably already know relative to other things how secure that is. But we can kind of compare. The table on the left here is the passphrases we've kind of talked about, as well as some longer variations, and the passwords on the other side. And this is the passwords this is the ones that require a true brute force. This is not what people are cracking on a daily basis. They're cracking things based on templates, topologies, dictionary words. They're not having to do that full 95 character brute force to try to exhaust that. But assuming this is, truly random passwords we're comparing to random passphrases, this is roughly some of the comparisons you get as far as, the bit strength, the total number of possibilities it would take someone to exhaust that entire set. We'll talk a little bit more about the password cracking, but remember that doesn't mean it's going to always take, the maximums. The average is halfway through that maximum, you're probably going to get cracks. But you can kind of see that, even once we're getting to 5-word Diceware passphrases, we're looking at stronger security than like a 9-character password that's randomly generated, and it goes up from there. So one of the problems, or at least limitations of Diceware, is the words themselves. If you remember going back to that slide where I show the excerpts of the indexes, you may remember. Flashback to it here. On the right side here, they've got some single characters. They've got some symbols of not just words. They've got the letter A, the letter B. They throw some of those in there, I think, in an attempt to try to meet some complexity requirements. But essentially, what that also means is the shorter these words are, you also have the opportunity to have 5. If you're just may hit the bad chance of rolling 5 single-letter characters. So you have a choice to make then as a user. You either stick with that and say, well, random is random, or you say, well, that's probably not a good passphrase for me to use, so I'm going to disregard that. And what that means in that sense is that you're then eliminating the pool of possible passphrases from that total pool that we looked at previously if you're looking at 5 words. The good thing is, it's a big number. I think it's like 380 million or something like that. But as far as the possible, if you're looking at just 5-word passphrases, you're eliminating a very small percentage of those by avoiding those words. So how does that play in? If you're giving someone this system, like family member or passing on to someone else, you may have to either add the caveat, hey, be smart about if you get 5 A's in a row, don't use that for a passphrase. Or especially if you're using it for an automated system of some type, a password reset system, or if you're generating service account passwords with it or something like that, you want to probably do some filtering on the random choices that come out of that. But that is going to have, like I said, even though a very small impact, it is going to have some impact on the words. So if you decide not to use Diceware default dictionary, they do tell you how to build your own. It's not terribly complicated. I'm sure probably most of you could figure it out. It'd be a fun programming, basic programming experiment for you. But that is one of the possible conflicts. And I know Scoob, you said something. We talked a little bit about this before. So during the Q&A section, if you've got more to add to this about some of the concerns about that, just let me know. We can talk about it then. So how do we increase passphrase strength? Well, the easiest way is to add words to your list. So going from 4 words to 5 words makes an exponential change in the amount of possibilities then that are there for that passphrase space. You can also increase the number of words. That makes a much smaller change. So I think, let's see, 78 bits. I think that was related to I can't remember what I was trying to draw there. I think that's 12, like the equivalent of a 12-character random password. But you can kind of see, like, if, hey, it's a lot easier for you to say, I'm going to take a 9,000, 10,000 word dictionary and use 6 words from that, as opposed to trying to track down 858,000 words if I just want to stay within the 4-word format. But in theory, it's possible. We'll talk a little bit too about compatibility. Obviously, as you're increasing words, you're tending to increase the length of your passphrase, which there may be problems with the compatibility of the systems. You're trying to use that passphrase in. There's also another way, which is to modify the words from the original form. And all of this we've talked about with cracking and things like that. We've made the assumption that the attacker knows what system you're using. Like, they are specifically attacking Diceware or XKCD. They know your word list. They know how many words you have. Those are a lot of givens that, we try to avoid this security through obscurity, but that's a lot of givens that don't exist in the real world. So just keep that in mind, that, we're talking worst case scenario in many cases. But you can modify words from their original form if you're doing it in a random way. If you just say, I'm just going to capitalize all my Diceware words, that's probably going to buy you better security than someone who doesn't, just because attackers aren't, if they hear you're using Diceware, they're going to assume that your words are all lowercase. If you want to be secure about it, however, you would randomly apply that. So not every word is uppercase, not every word is lowercase. You're randomly generating which ones are which kind of effectively can double your word list. So instead of 2048, you're going with 4096. So something like this. You can also add in separators instead of the space character. You choose one of the random 33 or 32 other symbols and use that instead. That helps, again, add a little bit of the complexity to the passphrase if someone's trying to guess it. What's the shortest you could safely use? Because it's important you don't waste a lot of energy unnecessarily in trying to choose your passphrase. I mean, you certainly can, but to be most efficient, you wouldn't do that. Diceware, I think the web page still says 5, but Arnold came out here, I think, in the past year with a blog post that says, really probably that was 20 years ago, we should probably go ahead and increase 6 for normal use, so web pages or logins or things like that. He goes on to recommend 6 words for wireless security, file encryption, 7 to 8 for high value like Bitcoin. Those are his recommendations. And kind of going back to that strength you saw that was, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it offers pretty good security for those. It does, and the reason he splits these out by uses is that in many kinds, if you're going to have a password for 6 months on a website or a year on a website, you can afford to have a much less strong passphrase than if you're trying to have an encrypted drive or archive that you want to be uncrackable for 10, 15 years. That's a very different threat model that you may want to future-proof by choosing some longer passphrases. The EFF kind of echoes his advice. Secure Drop is a system that was designed for essentially a modification of Diceware for journalists to use to talk with sources anonymously in a secure way, so they don't have to, everybody doesn't have to figure it out on their own. They recommend 7. Realistically, and be careful about this. I mean, if you're just talking about like logging into Reddit or logging into your Discuss comment profile or logging into things, especially with just 3 words, if you're doing some modifications, those are probably going to work out in many cases. So cracking time, I was kind of cautioned and talking about this on Twitter ahead of time. You know, don't just talk about fast hashes. I get that. We're not always, especially in cases where you're trying to protect things you really care about, fast hashes like MD5 are not going to be particularly giving you good feedback. They may give you a false sense of insecurity when it's not as bad. So here's some rough benchmarks, and these are estimates. This is based on benchmarks, not someone actually trying to crack diceware, because they have to use a type of attack with a password cracker that is slower than this. In many cases, they probably will, especially like I mentioned, if they don't, this is them specifically attacking the dictionary with your dictionary with full knowledge of how you implemented it. So you can kind of see the Snowden mystery box. That was where Edward Snowden cautioned Loya Poitras about assume an adversary can try 1 trillion possibilities per second. That's probably realistic for a government or a large, very extremely large corporation. The 8 GPU system is from Jeremy Gosney's. It's Jeremy Gosney, Sajida Systems. It's an 8 GPU, roughly $18,000 to $20,000 investment. So that's not, it's probably beyond the regular everyday cracker, but not for someone that has limited resources. So you can kind of get an idea just based off different word counts, XKCD, diceware, and just some modified custom word lists you might produce, an idea of realistically what we're talking about as far as something that'll crack things. So shortcuts. One thing I have not seen any research on is if surely people have biases. Like I don't want to choose endocrinologist within a passphrase. So if you randomly come up with the word endocrinologist and I'm not familiar with it or I'm not sure I can spell it right, I may choose to regenerate that passphrase. If someone could gather a lot of information about those kinds of biases and preferences and then customize a cracking attack against passphrases, that might provide them some shortcuts other than guessing, a true brute force guessing every single combination. You might also get lucky and find a combination that matches, within 4 words, especially the shorter the phrases you have. You may hit a phrase that hits in natural language. It also may already be in their word lists, or a combination that was leaked from a plain text source. So don't reuse these strong passphrases if you're going to choose to use it for something else you don't want to have cracked. So what's kind of the resistance to passphrases? Because there are some inherent problems with it, or inherent resistance that I've seen. Talking to people about it, part of the problem is that we discourage. These are some password policy excerpts from different places. We obviously very reasonably try to reject word use. The problem is, of course, that we want people to use words in the right context with the system, so you kind of have to maybe do some education when it comes to that. Disappointingly, Bruce Schneier also kind of fell into the trap of thinking that, apparently after reviewing an article from ours that had some cracking results from Jeremy and Jen Stube and some others, and seeing passphrases like this, which are, common phrases, band names, a phrase with, a guessable word on the end of it. Those are things within the reason of cracking, but this isn't an attack on a diceware type system. But anyway, he ended up coming out and saying, well, that's why this is no longer good advice. And sadly, I've had to argue with lots of different people about that being a good thing. There's some password usability research. I'm going to kind of jump through this, but there's been several studies. I've highlighted a few of them here that have talked. This one specifically about the XKCD cartoon and analyzing, how does that compare to random passwords? How does that compare to using all nouns or trying to use a system that is, follows natural language patterns? Another one, like I said, I'll have references to these if you want to dig into them. But one I want to just finish up with here is actually taking some of these passwords, the first 3 of these from Diceware and the 4th and 5th from essentially modified Diceware, modified XKCD passwords, and trying them out on some of the different websites and seeing what types of problems I had, some of the primary websites. So you can kind of see the length here in the end, 24 characters. 16 is the shortest. I purposely probably shorter than you would use for a secure system, but just to see how that played, up to 33 characters in length is the maximum. And that's, fairly short. That's only 6 words, and one of the words is very short. So I started out with social media. I tried to figure out what the maximum password accepted was. Everybody did great. Everybody accepted all the passphrases that I had. Pinterest, there was only one note that I had, which they silently truncate at 85 characters, which is not great. So if you plug in a 150 character string, it accepts it, gives you no errors. You try to log into it, it accepts it, no errors. But you really only needed the first 85 characters of that to log in, and they don't give you that feedback. I literally just try like 150 characters, and then I try 149, and if I can log in with that, I keep reducing it until I figure out what's the maximum, how that works out. So retailers, another group, you start seeing, a little bit more restrictions on what you can use. I've kind of noted here, like, going back to those numbers, which ones are which ones were rejected. eBay, they also silently truncate. 64 characters. But if you get the complexity within the first 64, they won't complain. But if the complexity was at the end, they would tell you that password wasn't accepted. But you can kind of see some don't accept spaces, some don't accept other kinds of characters as separators. If you wanted to have pound sign between your words as opposed to spaces, some of them had some max length requirements, like Walmart's 12. That's pretty rough. I mean, that's not great. At least, 64 I could kind of work with. When you're looking at 12, 16, 20, that's hard to get a passphrase in and have it work. Home Depot was another one where I found that they had an error where I could put % signs in my password and it would accept it fine, and then I tried to log in and it would error out because they're not probably doing something with encoding. Who knows how that worked out. So finally, financials, I didn't get quite as many of these, but I looked at some of the big ones. And again, with a lot of people I know, we know that these traditional banks or traditional financial companies aren't real, on top of things when it comes to this. But you could see again that there was a lot of restrictions. They either accepted one, the traditional, PayPal, Chase, Discover, and then some of the Bitcoin-related exchanges and other services. They were a little bit better, but Coinbase also silently truncated at 72 characters. So that's kind of the feedback. This is, you're going to have varying success, especially with online applications. Offline applications you might be a little luckier with. So when should you use them? It's not probably appropriate to use passphrases in any case. If you have a password manager that can randomly generate strings, you're going to have more security within a short space with that random string, and if you don't have to memorize it, that's probably the better way to go. But if you have to regularly type it, like logging into my laptop, logging into your password manager or your secure drive, those are times where it might make sense to have a password, when you're kind of required to commit to memory. Security question answers, when you communicate with your voice, when I used to send people PGP, self-decrypting archives, it was much easier for me to give them a 5-word passphrase than 12-string characters. That's kind of that advice. If you are an admin or IT security and you're helping make these systems and test these systems, certainly try to avoid unnecessary maximums. Sometimes that's based on vendor software. You don't have any control over it. Restricting symbol use or even requiring symbol use. There's variable, like one of the next slides I'll talk about the Stanford system, where they essentially say, the longer the passphrase, the less restrictive or less requirements we're going to have, because you have to have symbols and numbers and letters. You can just have all lowercase, if it's 20 plus characters. All right, I'll finish with this. This is my niece, Isabella. She turns 1 year old tomorrow. I'm going to have to get her a vocabulary book and work with her. Right now she's got a very small word list to work from, but it seems to be pretty effective. So there's the references. I'm going to be around. Certainly feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, I'm really sorry.
No questions? All right.
Sorry.